I'll just give it maybe one more minute.
Amy, while we're waiting, you did an awesome job. Chris, you did too at the Sustaining Colorado Watersheds Conference. It was a really good conference. And yeah, I really enjoyed, I learned a lot from both of you guys. So just really appreciate your presentations.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. That was a great couple of days.
Yeah, thank you.
Good.
All right, let's go ahead and get started. I think, Courtney, we just have a quorum with 6 officially on, and then we may have a few others jump on here in a couple of minutes. So let's go ahead and get going because we do have Chris Sturm here today, and I really appreciate, Chris, you joining. So I want to go ahead and get this meeting kicked off. So today we will spend, I would say, the first half of our discussion hearing from Chris Sturm, who is the watershed program manager at CWCB, to talk about the Wildfire Ready Watersheds presentation. And this is a great setup for some of the discussions that we've been having about a free pre-fire playbook and how to better connect all of the actors from your pre-fire stage to your post-fire actors as well. So I think this will be a great discussion to hear from Chris. And Chris, we'd certainly welcome some of your feedback on some of the points that we've been discussing. So we'll spend the first half with Chris, and then I think I have sent around a couple times just a very draft document that summarizes some of the recommendations and discussions that we've been having over the last few months. So we can spend the last part of this meeting getting any additional feedback on that document and discuss with the group where to take our efforts from here and how to structure some of our future meetings. So before we turn it over to Chris, it would be great to get our action item out of the way to accept the meeting minutes from our October meeting. So I will pause if anyone has any questions or amendments to, we'll wait for Jody. She's almost finished with the meeting. So why don't we take that up? We'll take that up right after Chris's presentation. So with that, Chris, I will go ahead and kick it over to you. And I think you should be able to share your screen if you'd like.
Okay. Are you seeing my screen?
I am.
Okay, perfect. Well, I think a lot of the folks attending this meeting have already seen the presentation. So apologies for those that have. I'm going to move through it quickly, though, because I'm really just interested in getting some feedback from this group. And Amy, thanks so much for having me here today. I appreciate that. So we're talking about the Wildfire Ready Watersheds. This was a legislative directive from 2 sessions ago. And we came up with this mission statement. We got together as a group with my consultant team in July of 2021. Boy, it seems like a really, really long time ago for me because we've worked on this for so long. But anyway, we're doing 2 things here. We're assessing the susceptibility of Colorado's water resources and communities and infrastructure to post-wildfire impacts. And that's going to result in statewide maps that show where we're vulnerable. And we're also advancing a framework for communities so that they can implement their own plan to develop mitigation strategies to minimize these post-wildfire impacts before the fires occur. So, Amy, I guess for your group, something to be thinking about as I go through this is, how does this dovetail into what you're envisioning for the pre-fire playbook? Because a lot of the technical pieces, I believe, are built into the Wildfire Ready Watersheds framework. Just real quickly, why even do this? Well, there's a lot of interest in forest health, and we certainly got a lot of feedback from the comment period for the water plan, Colorado's water plan, but you could just see different bullets here of what we're interested in. Flow regimes, protecting flow regimes is a big topic. resilience, and my definition here is that our healthy watersheds are able to resist, absorb, and recover from natural hazards. Of course, all the different water uses that rely on forested watersheds, and then our environmental and ecological interest in healthy watersheds as well. That's the why. Why do we approach it? And just real quickly, there's two components again. The legislative directive said CWCB developed this statewide susceptibility analysis. And then we as staff decided that it would also be good to create a framework for local communities to implement. So what exactly are we talking about? And when I'm talking about the statewide susceptibility analysis and the local framework, we're really looking at identifying where our values at risk are relative to where we have the potential for post-wildfire hazards. And values at risk we're looking at in two major categories. That would be our water infrastructure and then our built infrastructure like road crossings in our communities. So life and property, big piece of that value at risk. And I'll get into the specifics of these as we run through it. Just real quickly, the data sets that we're looking at for the statewide analysis are at the hydrologic unit code 12 level. So that's a USGS measurement of watershed size. HUC 12s are generally pretty small, 10 to 40,000 acres in size. And we have about 4,500 of those statewide, depending on how you look at them as they bleed into the other states that bound us. As you look at the value at risk maps, I'm just going to have a few examples. You'll see it's statewide coverage. We're really into the overlay analysis now where we're looking at values at risk and the hazards together. And so the maps tighten up a lot as we would expect based on where we're likely to see these hazards after a fire. Just a real quick look at the history of fires in Colorado. I thought this was some cool data I got from the National Interagency Fire Center. For fire history from 1890 to 2020, I'll caveat this by saying I suspect the data sets are a little weaker the further back we go in time. But anyway, just to show you the point here, there's 2002 to 2020. There's 1890 to 2020. So most of the fires on this map have occurred in the last 20 years, or 22 years. I don't have it updated for the last couple of years, but our last big fire year was in 2020. And these pink shaded areas are the 10 largest fires, certainly not the most devastating. These were all very impactful, but we've had smaller fires that had significant impacts as well in the last 20 years. So value at risk data. We started by looking at the Colorado State Forest Atlas and said, what's already existing out there? And we heard from some water users, yeah, their critical watershed layers okay, but CWCB, we think that you could do better and beef this up. And of course, being the water policy agency that we are, we wanted to do a really good job with it. But we did dissect what the State Forest Service had, and their municipal intake layer was really important. So we pulled that out after talking to them for a while about what else was mixed in there. So this evaluates the number of intakes that rely on a given watershed. And again, those watersheds are HUC 12s. If you look real closely at the map outside of the colored areas, you can kind of get a feel for the size of those HUC 12s. Reservoirs, another big one for us. This was difficult as we got into our lake layer for the state. We, in the end, decided to go with the jurisdictional dam layer, which is about 2,500 records for the state. This is an example from the South Platte. All these little triangles are different reservoirs. We did turn this point layer into a polygon layer so that we could find out which of the HUC 12s, which of those little watersheds actually drained into that polygon, because they're the value at risk is the watershed itself draining into the reservoir. Built flow lines. These are our ditches and canals. So this is indicates where burn basins could affect the actual ditches, not just the head gate, but the canal as it exists across the landscape. And then another layer for decreed water rights. This considers the decreed volume within one of those Huck 12s. And then we got some data from Colorado Parks and Wildlife about aquatic species habitat. These are gold medal fisheries or sport fisheries. It's got a lot of different layers in here that we incorporated as a value at risk as well. So those are just some examples. There's a lot more. At the end, I'm going to have the website up where you can go to a fact sheet that talks about all our data sources, where we got them from, and what types of assumptions that we used as we go into the analysis. Again, the values at risk have to be coupled with hazards. And so here's our hazards: hill slope erosion, increased runoff, debris flows, flooding, and fluvial hazard zone, which are patterns of erosion and deposition and channel migration associated with flooding and debris flows. So as we looked at the risk, which is synonymous with susceptibility, again, I like to drive this home several times. If we have values at risk without the probability of a hazard, then we're not saying we don't have susceptibility. A lot of folks on the Eastern Plains have seen devastating grass fires. And I don't want to belittle those, but the post-wildfire hazards associated with those are generally not great, and you'll see that in our analysis. We usually don't see big changes to hydrology after our grass fires. So just some examples of the hazards, and I don't have them all, but just to give you a flavor of it. Hydrologic change. This evaluates the magnitude of change in runoff following a fire. So we ran a pretty simple hydrologic model for the state in pre-fire conditions and post-fire conditions, and looked at the departure flows between the two and came up with this analysis. So as we go from green to red, there's a larger departure in flows, so more runoff post-fire. Hill slope erosion, we used the modified universal soil loss equation to look at areas where we're likely to see great increases in hill slope erosion after fire. And debris flows, a big one for us. We use some USGS regression models to look at the probability of debris flows across the state. Now this slide that you're looking at here is an example of where we did an overlay. This shows the intersection of where we're likely to have a high probability of debris flows after fire and where we have reservoirs. So that's the intersection of a value at risk with one hazard, just to give you a flavor of what these susceptibility maps will look like. And this is, I believe, the only example I have. We're actually trying to finish these up before Thanksgiving, and we'll have them on our website. We're going to have an overall map that shows all the values at risk with all the different hazards. That's kind of messy. We're also going to show just the water infrastructure values at risk with the hazards and the built infrastructure with the hazards. And then we're going to make it kind of an interface where you can turn layers on and off, so you can see different water users or different communities can turn on the values at risk they're most interested in and the hazards to see this overlay. On this map, we also put some purple hatching on it to show our wilderness and roadless areas, because of course, we've got different mitigation strategies that are going to be associated with working in those areas. I did make the comment at the conference, Christina, that wilderness areas are looking pretty good. I didn't mean that from a forest health, like from a fuels point of view. I meant it more from a channel network point of view. So I think a lot of our wilderness areas, the channel networks are well equipped to absorb debris post-fire. But of course, that's going to be unique to every situation. So as we're looking at framework implementation, we'll have to have closer looks at conditions of our channel networks within those wilderness and roadless areas. Okay, let's jump into the framework. This is the cool part. And I think this is the part, Amy, that you probably wanted me here for the most. The statewide susceptibility map is going to be informative. but we are not limiting who can implement the framework based on just that statewide map of how it lights up. So we're building this guide for local groups and agencies that they can produce local level susceptibility evaluations and come up with strategies for both pre-fire and post-fire mitigation. It's primarily going to be delivered in the form of a scope of work. Really eager to get people working on this quickly. The scope of work's in draft form right now. It's going to be out right before or right after Thanksgiving. And the idea is that groups can take this, use it to apply for grant funding, and use it to put it into requests for proposals as they're hiring consultants to do this work for them. And it steps us through a lot of the activities associated with, how do we put a plan together that's actionable? I'll mention that my board has approved a special release of the Colorado Watershed Restoration Program. They approved this in September. We have a new funding source through House Bill 1379. Those are American Rescue Plan Act dollars. It's a $10 million grant program, and I'm going to release that along with the framework in mid-December. That's what I'm aiming for. And I'm hoping that we get a lot of applications for implementation of this framework. But I also realize there's a lot of folks out there that have already done a lot of pre-fire planning and have identified mitigation projects. So it's also available for project implementation for those groups that have been through planning processes similar to what I'm outlining. The framework's going to be supported with a lot of different fact sheets. My vision right now is to kind of link these fact sheets from the scope of work. So as we're talking about hydrology and hydraulics, we'll link directly over to that fact sheet so you can learn more about it. But here's a flavor of the different fact sheets that we have. We're also working on a newer one that kind of talks about where this framework fits with other elements of forest health, like CWPP, CWP squared. The Forest Service has potential operational delineations. I saw Brett on this call. CFRI just released a great fact sheet that talks about CWPPs and pods, the potential operational delineation. So that was kind of our inspiration for putting something together to see where we fit with all of those. Because this is not meant to replace those planning types, but should absolutely be dovetailed into that type of planning where it exists at the local level. So quickly, I'll go through the framework. There's different tasks. The first two are more dedicated towards the social end of this. We have to have a stakeholder-driven collaborative in order to compete for these CWCB dollars. It's always good to have partners and stakeholders when we're working in watershed health because we're going to cross over a lot of political boundaries. And we need to define how we're going to collaborate, what our outreach strategies are, what types of workshops we want to hold, or other targeted outreach strategies. And that is in our draft scope of work. I was reading through it last week. I had a lot of emphasis on workshops, and I kept putting and other targeted outreach strategies because I'm hoping that we can evolve in how we collaborate with each other and not necessarily just invite everybody to a workshop. And if you miss that, you missed out. There are a lot of important stakeholder groups that maybe need more targeted approaches. The data collection is a huge piece, and this is something that my technical team in the CWCB has done for a lot of those fires that I showed you in the maps earlier, especially the Big 20. We've been involved in some type of recovery in every one of those top 10, I mean, not 20. And we're always scrambling after the fire. Oh, we need this data from the county. We need this data from the water district, from all the water suppliers. So having a handle on where that data is, who's in control of it, who's updating it, what kind of condition is it in? Is it in a usable format for the way that we want to use it, or do we need to make some changes? And then, of course, gap analysis. And one big thing that I see is the debris flow analysis I did at the statewide purview is good for just that. It's not going to be a good data set for these local level studies. We need something a lot more detailed. And right now we have decent debris flow data sets for some counties around the state, but it's not complete. So this could be an example of where we work with the Colorado Geological Survey to start filling in the gaps to get this really good data set. But there's other stuff out there we'll be missing as well. And then looking at hazard analysis, again, we've identified our values at risk. Where are we likely to see these hazards? And we talked about those different hazards earlier. And then putting them together, overlaying the value at risk data that we bring in. These could be structure layers from your county. These could be road crossings. Of course, all our water infrastructure, reservoir layer, that's something that we built out that I think is going to be really helpful for a lot of different reasons. And then start to think about what are the consequences of, let's say, a debris flow in a community that doesn't have floodplain mapping, for example, and understanding where those hazards exist before a fire and really lead to us making some good decisions about our preparedness in advance of the fire. Do we want to do mitigation before the fire? And what might that look like? Or do we just want to identify what types of mitigation we would do after fire, but have a good handle on that in advance? I'm thinking we're going to get a mix of both. At least that's my hope for a lot of the cases where we have the framework being implemented. So what does that look like? And I'm almost done here, folks. I like to go back to this one. Helps me talk about some different mitigation strategies. And I think about examples that I've seen all over the state. And one of them is in the Spring Creek fire down in Huerfano County. There's some areas down there where the cost benefit did not point towards any type of on the ground project. There's maybe 3 or 4 houses that are served by a small private road, and the cost to make them resilient to the post-wildfire impacts, it's not achievable. It's, you know, 7 or 8 figures, and you'd be better off buying them out. But what can you do? Well, early warning systems in that instance were incredibly important. How do we let these folks know that they've got 10 or 15 minutes to get out of their house? Because there's some, you know, we've got gauges, we have rain gauges, we have stream gauges set up. It took a lot of work to set that up after the fire. And meanwhile, all along, they're at risk with no warning system. So that's part of what we're envisioning as a mitigation strategy. It's just identifying areas where maybe structural improvements or projects aren't going to help. We know that there are values at risk and houses and lives at risk. So let's think of what an early warning system would look like. And I'm not saying that we go out there and set everything up. Of course, you know, precip gauges always help us out for other reasons, but just having that scoped out so that in the event of a fire, it can be pulled off the shelf while the fire is still burning, and think about implementation. I bring that one up because that's something we already have. We have a scope of work for an early warning system. We've vetted it with a few different stakeholders, including the Division of Water Resources and the USGS. So we're feeling pretty good about that. Of course, there are structural things that we could do as well. And I'm kind of ending here with just this example. I've used this slide for so many different things, but think about our high mountain reservoirs. So in the top left here, you know, how do we protect our reservoirs from filling up with sediment, from the water quality impairments associated with that? Well, having a really good understanding of our drainage network above those reservoirs is a good idea. And in this example, these are both depositional areas, or should be. The one on the left is functioning pretty well. So if we had a fire, I would expect a lot of sediment and debris to be stored on the floodplain before it made its way down to our reservoir, for example. The picture on the right should be a depositional area, but right now it's just a sediment source. It's already causing problems downstream. So we might identify areas like this for restoration. During and after a fire is not a good time to be approaching this landowner and saying, hey, we want to come in here and do a lot of work on your property. So understanding where these areas are, approaching them about restoring these areas in advance of a fire is very helpful. If a fire never occurs, I don't see this as a wasted effort. There's a lot of other reasons for us to do these types of projects. In fact, the CWCB has been doing them for many, many years. This is just a more targeted approach at where we're locating these types of projects. And I'll further say on this one that we may also want to talk to the Forest Service and say, do you have pods, potential operational delineations? Or talk to Courtney, who's on the call here. Are you guys doing any fuels treatment work in this watershed? Because we could do this in a way where it's the old belt and suspenders approach. We're going to do some forest treatments to mitigate burn severity, but we're also going to look at the condition of our channels so that in the event of a fire, we've already mitigated burn severity and we've identified and restored places that can hold sediment and debris above our value at risk. That last part being very important. What are we protecting? So I appreciate y'all's patience with me, especially those of you that have heard this once or more. There's a QR code here for the website. It's wildfirereadywatersheds.com. There's a education resources tab there that has a version of this presentation. It also has a fact sheet that talks about the value at risk and hazard data that we're using. And this is where we'll be serving up all the results, all the statewide susceptibility maps, as well as information about the scope of work for the framework and the grant program. So that's a lot of info. I guess, Amy, I'll take questions now.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate your time spending a few minutes with us today. I know your time is valuable, and want to say thanks. Right as we started the meeting, we have Commissioner Cooper, John Ring, and Julie Stencil that joined us, and then Julie from Rep. Nagusa's office. So thanks everyone for being here. But absolutely, let's open it up for questions with Chris. And I see John Ring, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Amy, for having Chris on. This is the first time I've heard it, so it's really great. It reminds me a lot of the BLM's REAs, so rapid ecological assessments from a few years ago. Sorry. Question for Chris. Can you go back to GIS and mapping? Can you have the ability to prioritize those different things? So I guess my question is, can you come up with a map that has like red areas for bad, you know what I mean? Like overall, so we can.
Absolutely, John. And that's kind of the intent. I'll just give you an example. We've been through this before, but never had the luxury of doing it before the fire. We do it after the fire. So for the East Troublesome fire, we built a hydrologic and hydraulic model and looked at the post-fire runoff conditions. And then we got the structure layer from Grand County. And that gave us lots of hot spots on the map where there were neighborhoods at high risk. And we did turn that into a heat map. And what that did was it clued the NRCS in on where they should be doing their damage survey reports to support the Emergency Watershed Protection Program. And that's usually first federal money in after a disaster like this. And they always struggle. Well, where should we go? What's at risk? And they really appreciated the approach that we gave them. We just showed them the map.
Awesome. I as our coordinator, I have a lot to say in that. So I appreciate that very much. But I would like to see a map that, you have all your heat spots and then some entity chooses prioritization, right? Like whatever, debris flow, down the line of layers, and then we have a map, right?
Yeah. And the intent is that the stakeholder group that's leading the effort would identify the priorities. And of course, they would have the support from myself and my technical team to answer any of those types of questions. But it's not our intent to come in and tell everybody what they need to do and where they need to do it.
Okay. No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Sure thing.
Commissioner Cooper?
Hey, Chris, thank you. This is great and really well presented. Sorry, I got here a little bit late, spinning my head around taxes earlier. Wonder if there's a sort of existing forest condition layers, or if this is really just looking at sort of the wildfire, well, not just, because watersheds are really important. But is there a sort of existing forest condition layers that you had on here maybe before I got on?
Hillary, it's good to see you, by the way. It's been a long time, but I don't have those layers in here. I suspect they exist, and it's a good thing Brett's on the call because he could probably tell us more about that. But we're not setting this up in kind of a thou shalt manner. Like, it would be absolutely appropriate for folks to bring those types of layers in if they wanted to couple the post-wildfire hazard planning with existing forest conditions to kind of inform where they should be doing more traditional forest health treatment work associated with mitigating these hazards.
Got it. Thanks.
But I appreciate your comment, and I'll make a note of it so I can look into that with my contacts with State Forest Service.
Commissioner Shattuck McNally.
Thank you so much. Chris, thank you for this great presentation. I feel like it's a really interesting segue from my previous meeting with the Cameron Peak recovery meeting. I just got out of a 2.5-hour meeting, and we had the Coalition for Buda Watershed and our Office of Emergency Management, Big Thompson Watershed, and they all presented together, and we're all working collaboratively on those projects. And we did have some maps that's overlaying where the Cameron Peak fire was, and then it has the heat maps of the intensity, then it has the heat maps of the point source mitigation, and then the area mulching, and it's showing the different zones. So we have some maps like that we're working on that they're asking the layering. And my question is, so when you're working on this, are you working with some of these recovery efforts? I know the NCRS and some of them, the EPW and all those people are working together, but are you taking some of this information and some of this research that's happening in my county and helping inform your efforts, or how do you guys coordinate with that? That's my first question.
Yeah, and I'll say that the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed has been a longtime partner with the CWCB. I actually worked with Larimer County to help convince them to fund that group before they even started. But Hallie's a longtime partner with us, and I've done this presentation for her and gotten feedback from her. I think she's seen it probably several times now. But the type of data that you are talking about is more specific to the framework implementation. So the CWCB is not going to be implementing the local scale framework, the latter half of the presentation that I gave. We have a funding source, and we're looking for partners to come to apply for our funding to make that happen. So those data layers that you're talking about, we did not use for our statewide susceptibility analysis. We used the best data that we could find that existed at a statewide scale. And it's typically not as fine-tuned and detailed as what you were looking at today. But that's exactly the kind of stuff that needs to be brought into the local framework implementation.
Awesome. And my second question, if I might, Madam Chair, is we had some conversations today about the climate change or climate conditions that we are taking into account with some of this restoration work. And I missed the first part of your presentation. I apologize, but we had our meeting. Of course, we asked lots of questions that go forward, and I'm sure it's in there. But we also talking about the changes in even what we're planting and doing things from the start. And so I was wondering how that, and maybe I missed that. I apologize if I'm making you repeat yourself. But what is that informing with some of the conditions of just changes with the ecological conditions for some of the native species that are maybe battling some of these noxious weeds or some invasive species? And how does that all interact to kind of challenge to add an extra layer of issues for the watersheds to deal with? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I went back to one of my original slides on the why. Why are we even doing this? And wildfire ready watersheds is just another door that we could step through to start achieving resiliency. And that's why I went back to this slide, because healthy forested watersheds can resist, absorb, and recover from natural hazards. I'm not going to make the call on how is the forest type going to change in your backyard? I don't know. How much hotter is it going to be? How much more or less rain are you going to have? How stronger the storm's going to be? I can't answer all of that, but what I can say is that healthy watersheds that are resilient are going to need an active approach for the most part across the state. And it's going to be a mosaic of different project types. It's not going to be a one and done, or we did this here and this there and we're done. It's going to be a lot of different things. And so this program that the CWCB here is offering, it isn't the answer to everything, but I think it's a really good way for people to think about a relevant topic, fires, and approach it from a way that says, we're going to invest some time and money into our ecosystem here to help us be more resilient. And I'm hoping to inspire folks that way. Of course, there's other elements of the framework as well. I talked about the early warning system. That's not an ecological approach, but a big piece of it really is understanding our existing environment and our watersheds and how we can improve it to help be more resilient.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of your presentation. Appreciate the link so I can look at it, and thanks. Really great stuff here. I appreciate the opportunity to listen from you today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Go ahead, Christina.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Chris. This is awesome. The question I had was related to the storage capacity reservoirs. So you mentioned in one slide the 10, I think, like reservoirs that had most storage capacity. I'm curious how that is used. The reason I ask is like Strontia Springs Reservoir, where 90% of Aurora Water's water, 80% of Denver Water's water moves through, is like teeny tiny, like it is not a storage reservoir. So it's actually one of the most critical reservoirs in our entire collection system versus, like I saw, like Cheeseman and 11 Mile, which are really big.
Yeah.
Storage. And so I'm just curious, like how that's factored in.
That's a great question. Thanks so much for asking it, Christina. And I saw that presentation about Strontia Springs at the conference, watershed conference. That was pretty interesting. I have to ask my guys to pull that part of the slide out, because we actually went through that when we were like, all right, how are we going to value the reservoirs, or the bigger ones? And that was straight in everybody's mind. Well, the bigger ones are going to be more important. And then we sat there and talked about it for a while, and I was like, you know what? We're not going to make a call on importance based on volume, because a very, very small watershed that serves one, or a small reservoir that serves one community, it may be the only thing they have. And that, does that make it less important than a big reservoir that a lot of communities rely on? No. So we're not putting a value on them volumetrically. And I guess that slide's a little misleading. It lists the largest reservoirs.
Okay, cool. That's
But
great.
we are looking at number of reservoirs within a Huck 12, and that does, more values at risk kind of elevate. We're more susceptible.
Okay.
But that's why I caveated it and said it's if you don't light up red or orange on that statewide susceptibility map, you're still going to be eligible to come in and implement the framework, because there's a lot of smaller water communities out there that don't have a lot of values at risk, but it may be the only thing they have.
Yeah. And the other is just a comment. I'm glad to see that the wilderness areas and roadless were put on that map. Yeah, that's something that it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's like there's so many great conservation benefits and source water protection benefits and watershed benefits associated with those areas. So they're critical, they're really important. But it's also tricky, to understand what the limitations are for traditional, like forest thinning, forest management techniques. So I think that's helpful just to know where they're at and know what options you have to either manage that land or the land around it. But just knowing where it is helpful. So yeah. Thank you. That's all I had.
That's a great comment. And I'll just add to it that knowing where they are is incredibly helpful. But then as we are looking at being resilient, actually going out there and assessing the conditions could be really helpful, and not just from a forest health point of view, but what does the drainage network look like? Like if we have a devastating fire through a wilderness area, do we think a lot of the runoff could be absorbed within the wilderness area? Or are we going to have a problem as it
Right.
daylights out of that boundary?
Go ahead, Commissioner Cooper, and then I have 2 wrap-up questions for Chris.
Okay, sorry to jump in here again. That conversation just sparked a bit of information that I wanted to share. We in the Telluride region or Upper San Miguel watershed, thanks to Chris and his team, have been able to do a substantial riparian restoration effort on a 600-acre piece of land that we were able to protect as town open space. And we're very concerned about the hillside and the community above the hillside, the resort community that is above the hillside. And so we've been talking about it for years. The Forest Service has been talking about it for years. The landowners have been talking about it for years. We finally went through a wildfire mitigation assessment and have been working on it for the last year and a half. The Forest Service just came back, and State Forest Service just came back and recommended that we not do the mitigation that we had planned to do. We knew it was going to be ridiculously expensive. We knew it was going to be helicopter logging, but we're talking about an entire community that's at risk with one way in and one way out. And so we were prepared to spend large amounts of money. And the recommendation was not to do the landscape mitigation. And so I think we need to, keep in mind that we do really need to target those areas that are that where we can do effective mitigation, and where it's we just need to do that smart assessment at the local level. And the take no action is we just found out potentially one of the recommendations or the recommendation. So just wanted to throw that out there as we talk about doing all this work. We continue to need to find where the work can be done and can be effective.
Chris, I have one. I'm going to sneak in with a question, then turn it to Brett. Christina's comment on the reservoir size made me wonder whether there was any mapping for municipal redundancy of really highlighting communities that might be reliant on one watershed for their municipal drinking water sources. And you might have touched on that, but is the framework going to identify those communities that are severely at risk because they rely on one watershed? And if there is a wildfire that damages that source or intake, that could have some severe impacts to the community?
Yeah, and Amy, that was my third mitigation example that I didn't get to. Maybe I'll start leading with that one. But that's part of the scope of work is water supply redundancy. It's specifically identified in our scope, our template scope. So we won't be able to provide that at our statewide susceptibility study. We just don't have a data set that tells us redundancy at local levels. I think, Brett, that was something maybe we were talking about last week. It's certainly an important thing to understand. And I think the town of Steamboat Springs is a good example. They have a plan similar to what I just outlined for you guys. And a big part of it was, okay, we need a redundant water supply or a redundant way to treat our water supply. And they came up with a strategy with mobile treatment if they can't get to their treatment plant because it is in the WUI. So it's going to be different for every community, but yeah, you won't have a finished plan if you haven't looked at that piece of it.
Gotcha. Thank you. Go ahead, Brett.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think this was great. Lots more follow-up. I guess I want to ask a question. I see Kirk Will with Division of Fire Prevention and Control is on. You talked a lot about similar concepts we've talked about as a committee of sort of a pre-fire playbook, but connecting pre-fire with post-fire and planning across both of those scenarios. I'm wondering how you've thought about, you mentioned the sort of pods framework, but what's your communication and coordination been with the FPC and thought on how this could be applied for fire management, thinking of keeping fire out of sensitive areas, but also using fire as a tool and acknowledging its sort of coexistence with us on the landscape to do benefit. So
Yeah, that's a good question, Brett. And I think I saw Angela on this call. So we're not given a lot of time to develop this program. And frankly, I'm impressed that my team's going to be able to deliver on time for the General Assembly. So there's still a lot of outreach and communication to do on how we bridge different disciplines together. But an example I have is this reservoir layer that we've now created. It was just a point dam layer. Now it's a reservoir layer. And what does that mean? Now we understand which watersheds drain into these reservoirs. Could serve very well with folks that are putting together suppression strategies. So for fire, that wasn't our intent with wildfire ready watersheds, but we start thinking about these data that we're putting together. We're like, wow, we can hand this over to folks and they could take this for other applications. So I think that the real work is just beginning now that we're developed the framework and we put all these data sets together to look at how we're susceptible across the state. But now how do we bridge it with other ongoing efforts is something that CWCB and myself are going to need a lot of help with, which is why I've given this presentation like 30 times in the last 3 months. And 3 more times this week, Amy. So kind of hitting that one back your way, Brett, and to the stakeholders on this call.
Yeah, Brett, that was a great segue into just my wrap-up discussion while we have you, Chris, is, a comment or a recommendation that we've discussed in this committee as part of the Forest Health Council has been creating this pre-fire playbook to complement post-fire playbook that exists to help provide clarity and roles and organizations, and to include a framework for capacity gaps and identify collaborative stages of readiness so we can point communities of, if you're at this stage, here's the best resources for you to leverage, whether it's financial or technical. So that's just a very quick summary of where we've been. But with the wildfire ready watersheds and the framework that you're working on, how would you see that recommendation complementing your work? Or do you see, a risk of duplication, or areas where, a pre-fire playbook could fill some gaps that the wildfire ready watersheds isn't filling?
Yeah, I think it could fill some gaps, Amy. I always get a little nervous because the Army Corps of Engineers wanted to do something similar. But of course, with me, it's always stakeholders. If we have folks from the state, within the state, that are looking for strategies, then I'm more interested in getting involved. With the Corps, we kind of gave them a bit of a, maybe you guys want to stand down and see what we're putting together before you throw something else out there. Because the last thing that we need is to confuse our communities with too many resources. And that just like paralyzes folks. I watch it happen after fire often. We can't even get an H&H model going after a fire because 3 different government agencies at 3 different levels of government all said they can do it. And then folks are trying to figure out, boy, well, I need to be strategic about how much it's going to cost, when they can deliver it. And then all of a sudden, 3 months has gone by and nobody's even built a model. That is so frustrating to watch play out. But I think we can work with you closely and others that are looking at this pre-fire playbook to see how wildfire ready watersheds fits in. It's a huge piece of it. But then I'll say we also have a unique opportunity right now. There's $10 million on the table. I'm guessing that one of these plans is going to cost anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 to implement. The CWCB is willing to fund 75% of that. And the match, only half of that 25% match has to be cash. So you're looking at getting into this game for like $12,000 to $25,000 of local cash match. Put together with the same in kind, which I don't think is a huge lift. The huge lift is just saying who's willing to do this, who's willing to start moving. I'd like to see as many plans as possible. Throwing out numbers, folks are asking me how many you think you can get going. Well, that's why I keep volunteering for these presentations, because I'm hoping that folks like you can help connect me with the people that actually want to do it. And I didn't mean to divert that answer away from what you were saying, but it's like we could spend all this time trying to make a perfect map for people to follow on how to approach fires, but we also have an opportunity in front of us right now to get to work and build your own local plan that comes with a list of prioritized actions. And what I'm hoping and what I've seen with stream management planning is that the projects that we've identified in stream management planning, the plans themselves are only 1% of the cost of the projects that have been identified. So if it plays out similar for this, it's going to be a tiny little investment in planning that's going to show us a huge need to fund all these implementation projects. I think that will help us with our federal partners.
It's a good point, Chris. And just thinking of our task of figuring out how to leverage resources, this can be a huge driving force to leverage some of the federal dollars that may continue to be available for the next 5 years or so, or beyond.
And I'm also not envisioning a huge drawn out stakeholder process for this. I think this is more of a type of work where a lot of stakeholders involved are going to be like, yeah, let's move. And if you had a core group of leaders that are implementing the plan, it could be more, let's go visit with our county commissioners and talk about what type of data we need from the county, what we're up to, and just kind of take it on the road to the different stakeholders rather than saying, okay, come on in, you know, we're going to meet once a month for the next 15 months. I'm really not envisioning it playing out that way. But I'm also not saying one way or another. So I've been around long enough to know that different stakeholder groups work different ways.
John, last question for Chris, and then we'll need to start wrapping up and thinking about topics for our next meeting.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So my question is this: the federal agencies have a lot of money right now, but the map, you say the heat map or whatever, you know, that would, if you had a heat map or the map, you know, that had, I don't know who prioritizes the you know, the individual and, you know, things, but if you had a heat map, that would help and getting money. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So.
And John, we will have a statewide susceptibility map.
Okay.
So we'll have a heat map for the whole state.
Yeah.
It's going to be pretty good. It's going to upset a few people too. It's never perfect when you're doing these big, large data sets, but my vision is if it's used properly, like I want to give it over to DNR and the General Assembly and the governor's office as a tool to use when they're talking to folks like you. To say, look at our need across the state. So
I view it as like there's pre and post fire, right? So like the pre-fire piece is like, you know, mastications, prescribed burns, vegetation management, and then the post fire is what do we do about debris flows and all those fun things. So that's what we're looking for, is that map. Like, how do we, where do we spend our money? That's basically
I think we'll have the best thing created to date so far. I really do. But in the end, it's gonna, to make real change on the ground, we're gonna need these local frameworks to be implemented. But we will have this statewide heat map for you, and that's going to be out before, well, it's got to be done before the end of the year, and I'm trying to get it done before Thanksgiving so that my consultant team's not stressed.
You don't have to tell me, but who are you doing it for?
Who am I doing it for?
Yeah.
I'm doing it for the state of Colorado General Assembly.
All right.
That's where the legislation came from. They said, get it done.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Chris. This is really incredible work, and I'm excited to follow along. And I think this is a critical group and the Forest Health Council at large to help with outreach and help this effort be successful.
Yeah, I really appreciate the invite, Amy. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we're a little bit close on time. We just have a couple of minutes before we wrap up, but I did want to make the most use of Chris's time while he's here. Before we wrap up, we have our draft document that I put together with just a stab at our draft recommendations. At our last meeting, we didn't feel like we were ready to do any sort of poll to prioritize where we might spend our time. I think Chris's presentation gives us a lot of thought on how we might move forward, but just in the last couple minutes, I want to open it up to the group on where we might go next. I think we can spend, the first part of our next meeting really diving into where we've spent our time and help prioritize or identify some more speakers or information that we need to help with some of the fact finding. So I'll pause and open it up to the group for any comments on how to structure our next meeting.
I guess I just feel like there's so much to cover. It's hard to prioritize. So I think that was a great presentation to kind of give that bigger overview. And I think the big comment that kind of still resonates with me when he said, well, each area is so unique and the mitigation work or the work needed in each area is going to be also need to be treated unique. And so I'm just wondering if we had a conversation about maybe approach looking how leveraging resources are different for different areas of the state and how that might be a conversation to have with how we look at this. I don't know, just like, I don't know, that stuck with me when he said that to my question. So I'm wondering, I didn't get, and I must think I missed the last meeting because I basically had overlapping meetings and I forgot, but I'd love to just hear from you what all you guys have been talking about. And it just, for me, there's just so much to think about that we could prioritize. So I'm still kind of struggling with that.
I think what folks can do is take a look at our draft document. The red lines are comments we added from our last meeting, which we tried to help with because that meeting got switched to a Tuesday. I know we didn't have our full group and I know a lot of our commissioners had their regular business during that time. So I think the homework can be to take a close look at our draft recommendations to date, send me any feedback of where you want to add some input or where you think some of the details might not be accurately reflecting the conversations. We can spend some time taking a look at that document and figuring out where to prioritize. But before we lose people, maybe we can do a quick accepting of the minutes if there's any questions or any edits. Otherwise, we can entertain a motion.
I'll move to approve the minutes.
I'll second it.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? All right, our next meeting, I believe, is Monday. I think that's the 5th at noon. So I'll take some time and put together an agenda. I can resend out that document and folks can send me any feedback over the next month. Thank you everyone for joining and I'll see you in a month.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks for organizing, Amy.